Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see quite a few familiar faces being back here in London, and plenty of newcomers this time as well, so welcome to all of you. As Keith said, I've spoken a few times. I think I missed the last time in Sheffield, but I'd like to get up here every so often and kind of give you an update on DDoS. My name's Sean Newman. I run product management for Carrero, but you'd be pleased to know, as usual, I'm not going to talk about product. If you want to know about our product and how that can help keep DDoS off your network, then you can come and talk to us in the foyer or go and look on our website if you're remote. What I typically do is kind of give you an update on where the problem is. What's going on in the DDoS landscape, what's the latest, what's going to be putting traffic on your networks that you don't want on your networks. And thinking back to the Sky presentation earlier, pushing that traffic around your networks, around your backhaul, is getting proportionally more expensive. So the last thing you want to be doing is pushing traffic around that doesn't actually add customer value and potentially, impacts your reputation as a provider. So when I was standing here, I think this time last year actually, we were talking about the kind of new innovation from the threat actors as far as using IoT devices. There's been a lot of talk about poorly secured IoT devices, and the tail end of 2016 and into 2017 we heard a lot about what was the Mirai botnet back then, and there was several very large and prominent attacks back then, 600, 800, potentially approaching terabit sized attacks. What we've seen during 2017 is I think the attackers kind of maturing in the way they're using these kind of weapons that they have now. We haven't seen larger attacks, but we have seen them being more considered in the way they're using them. At the end of the day, you think back to those large attacks and you say, well, okay, it's all very well, but it's annoying, it's a pain. The attack on Dyn took half of the eastern seaboard down as far as some big names on the internet. It's an inconvenience for the length of time it happens, but you ask, well, what the cybercriminals benefiting from? So what we've seen in the last sort of 12 months, as I said, is not those sort of size of attacks. We've seen IoT botnets evolve, and that's what I'm going to talk a bit about, and some of the tools that they're using to launch their attacks. But we're kind of seeing a more considered approach. One of the most recent sort of incarnations of the IoT botnet has been sort of given the cute name of Reaper, and it's really sort of taken the compromise of IoT devices to the next level. It's estimated there's 2 million plus devices that are either vulnerable to or have been compromised by this variant of effectively what started off as the Mirai botnet. But what we're seeing as the attackers get more educated on this, and the initial sort of realization of the mechanisms used for Mirai then get evolved, and people build on the techniques that were used. We're now seeing a much broader range of devices getting compromised. Back in those early attacks, it was sort of focused around DVRs from some sort of no-name company that you wouldn't know about that has very poorly secured software. Now what we're seeing is the devices getting compromised are much broader in their range. We're talking about webcams, routers, and also the names of the vendors of those devices are getting to be looking more like sort of mainstream type vendors. So these are the sort of vendors, you've got likes of D-Link and Netgear and those types of guys. You're thinking, well, these are the sort of vendors you expect might actually be paying a bit more attention to how secure their devices are. But the attackers are still managing to compromise them pretty easily. And the reason is the attackers have moved on. They started off with very simple mechanisms. If you think back to Mirai, that used just brute force password attacks, default passwords on devices that were easy to guess, username password pairs. The Mirai code was preloaded with a whole bunch of those, and it just used to try them in succession until it would get into a device. Now they're not relying on those, they're actually using more sophisticated vulnerabilities within the code itself. Thinking about scale, look back to the Mirai botnet and some of the ones I think I talked about at Manchester last year. There was this Elf image and the tsunami. They were doing their damage. They were generating these 600 gigabit, 700 gigabit, sort of terabit size attacks with 100 or 200,000 devices, which obviously is a lot of devices, but we're talking about 2 million plus devices now that are able to be harnessed in these botnets. So the potential scale is massive. But we haven't seen these bigger attacks, and this is my point about, I think the attackers are getting a bit more considered. Just flexing their muscles again, going, yeah, we can do the next biggest attack, might get them in the headlines, but doesn't actually get them any benefit. What we're starting to see, and what's been seen with this Reaper botnet, is those compromised devices being grouped into smaller bots that potentially can then be used to actually monetize the attacks. So being able to create those botnets and then hire them out as stressors, DDoS for hire services. There's still the potential that someone might put a large botnet together and create the next biggest attack, 2 terabit attack. But apart from proving a point, that doesn't get any benefit to the attackers. So being able to use these smaller bots and put them out for hire and actually generate revenue on the back of that is much more appealing. So I think that's the sort of trend that we're expecting to see. And if you look in the headlines, I said we haven't seen these bigger attacks creating news. But if you look at, for example, Carrero's threat report or any other DDoS vendor's threat report, DDoS is still on the rise. We saw the number of attacks for our latest threat report double compared to what we've seen previously. But these are smaller, more targeted attacks. I think that's something I've talked about in the past. DDoS attacks of the hundreds of gigabits are all very well, but actually most of the attacks we see are in the sort of single gigabit range, and actually a vast majority are a gigabit or less. If you know what you're doing as a DDoS attacker, you don't need to generate any volume bigger than that. So a DDoS for hire service where for a few dollars you can send a gigabit worth of traffic for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, that does the job for you. That makes your point, that enables you to get either your point across or find some other way of making money out of this. And the other thing that's happened, we started to see a new attack mechanism. And I said that, as Keith said, the title was about pulse wave attacks. We don't see the actual DDoS attack vectors change very often. Carrero, we discovered a connectionless LDAP attack back in last October, but it's not very often that you see new actual DDoS attack mechanisms. There's lots of, it's still based on flood attacks, SYN floods, ACT floods predominantly, or reflection attacks using DNS. An actual new attack vector doesn't come along very often. But with these large DDoS botnets, there's actually a new way of launching the attack that's been developed that we've seen more recently. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But I just wanted to go back to that point about how the increased sophistication has kind of moved things on to the point where there's a lot more devices that are now able to be compromised. As you'd expect, when Mirai first came out and it used these username password pairs, obviously then that raises everyone's attention. So now all the vendors are trying to find some way of either alerting users to making sure they change them or building something into their product that means the first thing you have to do when you power it on is change it. So the attackers are always trying to be one step ahead of that. So they're already looking into the code bases, starting to find new vulnerabilities that they can use to actually exploit vulnerabilities in the code to actually break into those devices and avoid them having to rely on things like those brute force attacks, which become a law of diminishing returns. At the end of the day, they need to keep a lot of devices at their sort of at their command, so that they can actually keep those services operating and keep themselves, in business and keep their reputation up within their community. So there's lots of things, vulnerabilities and zero-day injections and things like that. And really, it's going to be an ongoing challenge because we're still at this point where IoT devices are still genuinely very cheap. The processors on them are very low power. The amount of effort that gets put into developing the code is on developing the function of the device, not developing the security of that device. And I don't think that problem is going to go away. So what is this new pulse wave attack that we're talking about? Typically, we see attacks build and ramp over minutes. If it's a botnet attack, the botnet has to be mobilized. So typically there's delays and latency as far as getting all of the devices in the botnet actually operating and up to speed and aiming their attack at a particular target. But what we've seen more recently is attacks that effectively come in at full rate, but then modulate. And effectively the speculation here is that you effectively preload a botnet with a bunch of targets, tell it to go, it basically gets all the devices in the bot up to rate on sending the attack vectors that they're sending, and then they send it effectively at each target in turn, so modulating the destination that's being targeted. So they'll spend 2 minutes sending full rate attack for one destination, and then they'll just flip over and send that full rate to the next destination, and it could be alternating between two. You can imagine it could be modulating between a whole bunch of targets. And the reason for doing this is being able to ramp quickly up to a big rate is a good way of either quickly doing the damage or potentially evading, if quickly doing damage if there's no protection. But if there's like legacy protection or simple sort of threshold-based protection, if you come in at full rate really quickly, then it's really easy for that DDoS attack to do its damage before the protection that's in place has a chance to deal with it. So this is about having technologies where you're monitoring out of band, looking for DDoS traffic, then swinging traffic to something that then has to figure out what's the DDoS traffic, what's the good traffic, removing the bad packets, trying to keep the good packets flowing, versus having something that's always on, doing real-time inspection on a packet-by-packet basis so that you can actually keep up with the attack. So it's effectively like an evasion technique. And this is a sample actually from one of our customers where we first saw this attack hitting our customers. And you can see that each of the spikes, actually might be a little difficult to see the key from the back, but the key down the right is a whole bunch of different attack vectors that we see. There's ACK floods and various other attack vectors there. But you can see each spike has a number of attack vectors in it. But it comes and goes, and actually it's on this one is actually on a 2 minute cycle, so it's 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. So the expectation is that in the 2 minutes off, the botnet is actually attacking an alternate target, and it's just flip-flopping between the two. And so, how are the attackers making their money out of this? Some of them will still have motives that are still belief-driven, but we believe there's a lot of reasons why the attackers are actually starting to generate revenue from this. And one of the things that we've seen is actually a rise in what we've been calling DDoS for ransom. So ransomware is obviously pretty well known, but ransomware in general is pretty much tied to ransomware that encrypts hard drives, encrypts your data, and then charges you a fee to decrypt it and get you that visibility back. From a DDoS perspective, it's sending you a ransom demand saying, if you don't pay this much money, I'm going to attack you and take you offline for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, an hour. And it's very easy for the attackers to figure out as an organisation how much your online time is worth to you. They know how much every minute or 10 minutes, 20 minutes of online time is worth, and they can then size their ransoms accordingly. So having these on-demand botnets driven from these IoT devices is another thing that gives them those tools in their armory to be able to launch those attacks. And we saw a significant rise in this during the second half of 2017. And the challenge is it's difficult to know whether it's real or not. The thing that's really enabled this is things like cryptocurrencies where payments can be anonymized. So you don't really know who's doing it. You can't really track them down. Because of the attacks being launched from a botnet, there's no way of tracing back to the source. So it's very easy for people to launch these ransom attacks. And there's a couple of example emails here. I don't know if you can read the text from the back, but the real point here is, they're using names of, sort of well-known sort of cyber sort of criminal gangs like Phantom Squad, Fancy Bear, and others. But real way of knowing whether that's really them or not. But it helps them potentially increase the kudos of their attack. Ultimately, you don't know whether they will attack you, but the prospect of the size of attacks and the ease with which you can do it, helped along by these IoT botnets, is really making that much more of a reality. So, in summary, I just wanted to kind of give you a quick update today. So, DDoS, as I said, is still on the increase. If you look at our latest threat report, if you look at the sort of typical size of attacks, we're seeing the 1, 2, 3, 5, up to 10 gigabit size attacks are significantly on the increase. Those large multi-hundred gigabit attacks, we don't really see those. Those are headline grabbing. As I said, it's hard to kind of justify why the attackers would do those other than notoriety. But the real sort of smaller, short duration and lower volume attacks are still significantly on the increase. So this is still a serious problem. As I said, traditional protection, sort of threshold-based protection, and older techniques of out-of-band detection and swinging traffic to a central location that can then deal with it, has challenges, as we heard, like cost of backhauling traffic across your network that's bad traffic to then try and remove it. Doesn't feel like a good thing to be, well, never felt like a good thing to be doing, and as the cost of doing so is increasing, I think it's even more becoming more of a challenge. But at the end of the day, you want to keep it off your network, and as more and more organisations are relying on their internet availability, every minute, 5 minutes or 10 minutes of offline that they suffer costs big money. And we've had several customers that have started off with a cloud service thinking that they were covered from DDoS protection, have come to us because of our, effectively our online real-time protection. Someone can't, we have customers who have had like 15 minutes of off time because of an attack, and that's how long it takes their cloud service to kick in and start protecting them. With our service, they're protected without suffering any downtime. So, there's significant risk here from your perspective as service and hosting providers, potentially moving bad traffic across your network, which is obviously then either at greater expense of increased backhaul capacity or other costs associated with that. But there is an opportunity, and we've seen a lot of our customers not only benefit from a competitive advantage compared to other providers, so having DDoS protected service versus a non-DDoS protected service, even if you don't charge any more or add a cost for that service, you have a competitive advantage. But we also have seen a lot of our customers start to monetize that. So you can provide a basic service, and then you charge your customers for an added fee for a more premium level of protection. So you can protect against small attacks for free, and if you've got someone who's likely to be attracting larger attacks, you say, well, okay, attacks up to this size we'll protect for free. If you're attracting attacks over that size, then it will cost you this much per month. And I think the economics work out pretty well. Back to that point about how much online availability is worth to most organisations these days, it's a pretty easy sum to do. And short of any questions, that's everything I wanted to cover today. So happy to take questions now. We're out in the foyer all day, and as Keith said, we're sponsoring Pints and Packets tonight, so we'll be around then as well. If you want to come and chat to us, great. If you've got any questions now, happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sean.